Um, so Ross, you're in my office, my podcasting suite. What do we have going on tomorrow?
We're going on a canoe trip tomorrow. We're going to be paddling down the current river, camping on the beach, probably having some good old fun, maybe exploring some caves.
Mm.
Really, Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn in it tomorrow.
Do you like word association games?
I'm okay.
Do you like games in general, or are you all business?
I like games that I can win.
So I thought of as a little primer, a little game
Okay.
where you think of a word, phrase, sentence that makes you like uncomfortable, nervous, makes your armpits sweat a little bit. And we'll just go back and forth a little bit, a few times
All
to
right,
get us on this topic a little bit. So I'll say a word or phrase, sentence, then you go. So why don't you go first?
Okay, I'll go first. My first word, phrase, or sentence would be greasy.
Moist.
Dog mom.
Dog mom. I forgot to make one without onions. Anything else? Any other ones?
Sweaty.
Sweaty. Point is, there's some words or sentences that make us uncomfortable. Tonight's podcast episode is definitely one of those. Anne Marie Williams and her kid sister Claire, we put them in charge of this episode.
She is an adult because otherwise she could not talk about this.
We gave them the latitude to choose the speech, choose the topic, and they did. And they're doing it on the speech given by Abby Johnson in 2017 regarding the relationship between artificial birth control and abortion. So heavy topic, but we're going to try to share a little bit from our experience regarding this, kind of have a broad spectrum regarding us. Of some people have been married for quite a few years. One of us not married at all yet. So we'll see where it goes. Hey, how is it that every time Anne Marie and Claire go on, the episode is rated PG-13?
I have noticed this as well. But yeah, the last episode went really well, so I think it's gonna go good.
Yeah. So with that, let's cue the music.
When you see the road from every direction, it will give you eyes, give you hope, it'll give you perspective. I've been back and forth, and yeah, I had my crashes. Now I've seen the road, it goes every direction.
So Anne Marie, and Claire, this is your show. You're the host. You guide us.
Well, I think Matt, we just discussed this. I think Matt's going to launch it off and Claire and I will assist.
Yeah, I think I'll, just to keep the speech guys continuity, I might just be like,
who are these girls?
Girls don't know how to podcast.
Speech ladies.
No. But yeah, no, we kind of talked about that.
Do you guys ever tell people that you're podcasters?
What's that?
That was to the ladies. Do you guys ever tell people that you're podcasters? Now that you've done it twice?
Well, we haven't even had our second one under our belt, so let's just do that first. I'm going to hold off on updating my LinkedIn for the time being, but it's an option. It's on the table.
But anyway, we have a really exciting episode. I'm really eager to talk about it and get into things. It is a speech by Abby Johnson, the mother number 2 in our series on speeches by moms. And this is a talk at a fundraiser for Natural Womanhood, which is, I'll let Anne Marie say a little bit more about that. But it's a speech Abby Johnson gave on contraception, abortion, their connection, and kind of what it means for society and motherhood as a whole. So we wanted to give Anne Marie and Claire a little more latitude to kind of pick the speech. So this is the first non-speech guys selected speech, which is fun. To pick the speech and kind of give a little bit more guidance and stuff in terms of like, what's important, and to have, just a more holistic conversation on motherhood with 2 moms. So with that, I'll I'll just turn it over to Anne Marie. If you could just kind of tell us a little bit about why you picked the speech, and well, you and Claire, I guess, whoever wants to jump in first. So,
And the speech that we chose for tonight comes from a 2018 fundraiser for Natural Womanhood, and Abby Johnson spoke at it. This is something that she is able to speak about knowledgeably. So, without touching on her views on white versus wheat bread, climate change, or any number of other issues, we're going to take this speech on the merits as somebody who worked at Planned Parenthood for 9 years, that she is able to speak credibly on this particular topic, and that there are other people whose testimony corroborates the things that she has said here. So she started out as an escort and worked her way all the way up to clinic manager, and even received a manager of the year or employee of the year, I think. I believe it was employee of the year. I'll have to look that up. But yeah, she received some type of the year distinction before she headed out of the company.
Hey, Ross, have you ever earned a work award like Abby Johnson?
I have earned Employee of the Month twice.
Whoa.
For my department, not the whole. We're a big organization, so that would be a lot.
According to the billboards in my town, that's like 5,400 people.
If there's 4 departments at your work, Ross, then that's 1/4 times 1/6. That's your performance level compared to Abby Johnson.
I'm working on it.
That's 1/24. Your 1/24 is good as Abby Johnson.
Mercy. Employee of the year. I just looked it up. Employee of the year. Okay. That's what the distinction was. So at 15:10 in the speech, she makes the first of 2 points that Claire and I really wanted to draw out this evening.
And so it wasn't really until I started looking into what had drawn me into Planned Parenthood and what I had been then selling to the masses, that's what got me to actually look into what contraception was doing to our society and to these young girls that we're pushing it on. So I'm gonna briefly share with you Planned Parenthood's business plan. So their plan is to get into every private and public school system across the country. Okay, check. They've done it here. FY. They're going to get into your private and public school system, and they're going to start teaching your children their sex ed curriculum starting in kindergarten. Okay. Now, they're not actually going to teach them about sex in kindergarten, but the goal is they want to break down their natural modesty beginning very early. The primary goal is that they want to establish a relationship with your child when they're 5, 6, 7 years old.
Talking about this from the outside, it seems like, oh, this is so obvious. Like, how can you work there and know that? But Abby Johnson was the first one to acknowledge in her own talk that she lived that cycle, right? Like, she went and had a few abortions, and they continued to hand her the pill, which she knew hadn't worked for her, and she just took it. So I think that's just also interesting to note that, like, she lived that cycle, then she worked that cycle before, like, it really struck her as a problem.
So I guess I hadn't thought about that. Just thinking about, I don't know. I read the outline. Maybe it was in there, but like Claire's point she just made, that she lived the cycle. Like, obviously everybody kind of, I think most people that would know of her name would think of her as someone that worked for Planned Parenthood. So kind of giving her like she made it, the comment at one point, she said, I know because I used to teach that, or something like that. But so not only did she work that role, but she also she lived it in the sense that she was taking the birth control pill and became pregnant and had an abortion, I think, multiple times. So I guess I didn't really I don't know, that thought didn't really strike me until now that Claire just made, that the fact that she lived it, but it took her multiple times to start to question it. I don't know. I guess that just struck me a little bit there, Claire, when you said that.
what do you guys, what do you guys recall from your experience growing up in terms of like, what were you taught about birth control, contraception, that sort of stuff? Like, who was it that taught you?
Well, so I went to a Catholic grade school and public high school, so obviously slightly different tones there in either place. I mean, I definitely remember NFP being expressed like, this is what you are called to do as a married couple. And but I mean, you're also in 8th or 7th grade, so it's like, I mean, even a good Catholic school, I mean, what detail are you going to go into? So I mean, even in retrospect, I mean, I felt our teacher instructed on it in a pretty mature way, and um, I don't remember. She definitely never expressed whether she used it or not, which, yeah, that would definitely require a high level of vulnerability for an 8th or 7th grade teacher. But at the same time, it would obviously also mean a whole lot to the students to hear that. Um, and my teacher, 8th and 7th grade, I mean, they were both definitely Catholic. Um, yeah. So that was my high school. I mean, it was pretty much just your standard abstinence. I remember was definitely mentioned. Um, Condoms were the thing back then. Guess they still are. And I think the most striking memory from sexual education class or health class was, did you guys have to watch a video of a live birth?
Not till college.
Mhm.
Yeah, we watched it. I remember it was a European woman's live birth that we watched. It was heavy. It was heavy.
Did they show you guys pictures of STDs like genital warts and herpes and all that?
Yeah,
I remember
yeah,
that
yeah, they
was a
did.
big thing too. More like a scare tactic and shock and awe versus like education. But
But do you get the sense though that those both were meant to scare the heck out of you? Both the pregnancy, the birth
Yeah.
video, and the STI pictures. See, and I would just like to point out, like, I don't agree with that perspective. Actually,
you don't
I think if you're gonna,
you don't
I
think
don't
they
think.
meant to scare us?
Oh no, I think they meant to scare you, but I don't agree with the perspective that says we should treat pregnancy and we should equate in a way pregnancy and STDs as both something that's terrifying. Like, pregnancy is a beautiful thing. And pregnancy is a gift, and I don't think that's a good thing that we do in sex ed to basically say we're going to scare the bleep out of people by showing them what a live birth is. Like, this is a bad thing, so stay away. Just like STIs, stay away from those two, or STDs. So anyhow, what would you say, Ross? What was your
Well,
exposure?
to briefly rebut that, I mean, I think in fairness, it's like fear, guilt wasn't really at play there, but it is also a negative emotion like fear. I mean, it is definitely really useful. I mean, whether they should have also been using positive tools and elements to encourage a more virtuous, disciplined sexual path is a different story. But yeah, I mean, fear is what did Saint Augustine say? Fear is the heart of love, something like that.
Mhm. Yeah, I think there are a lot better ways though to communicate about pregnancy and why it would be worth postponing pregnancy or not being sexually active in the first place when you're in high school than by saying that this is a very terrifying thing. I don't think that helps young women to frame it in that way in particular.
Yeah, I suppose I never thought of it that way. In terms of like fear, yeah, just like the raw fear element. I suppose like it does communicate a certain seriousness to like what's happening in a way that does like grab kids' attention, you know. But yeah, I suppose like if I were to be in that, or yeah, I guess you would hope that they would like frame it and wrap it in a package that's more like this is serious, this is a real thing, and it is beautiful. Yeah, it is a beautiful thing and and is a beautiful process. But yeah, no, absolutely, definitely like an interesting, yeah, kind of subconscious element of like I mean, I would guarantee almost every public school kid in the country has seen a live birth video with the desire to scare, or that at least being a element.
I was just gonna say, like, what was your experience, Matt, like growing up?
Yeah.
Introduced to contraception.
I mean, I would say not terribly dissimilar to Mike's. I mean, I do know that as much as like I think public schools kind of get bashed, and as much as like Planned Parenthood has like had a deep influence on that nowadays, at least like I don't know if they did back 20 whatever years. It's been, I guess, 20 years now since I would have been exposed to this sort of stuff. But yeah, I mean, I do know that they like emphasized like in several stages along the way that abstinence is the only 100% sure way to avoid pregnancy and to avoid STDs, and like, yeah, just to, that it is a serious thing. I think they communicated that. They didn't communicate like the flip side of it in terms of like, well, what does it look like? What's the pot? There's a lot of no's and not a lot of like yeses. Like no to sex now means like yes to like a really good marriage, and yes to like a life of less pain and turmoil, and whatever, and like all this other stuff. But there's also like the sentiment, and I don't know if this was necessarily from the teachers, but more or less from like my peers, was like, I think how that message got interpreted was, don't have sex until you're married, but when you do, use a condom. It was kind of like this sort of, I don't know, tacit understanding that like, which I suppose it's true to some degree, like, yeah, people are going to fail on that regard. Like, I'm not naive to expect that all teenagers will have an impeccable sexual morality. But it was very much kind of a foregone conclusion, like, don't do it, wink, use a condom, I think was kind of how that got interpreted, at least. I don't know. I don't recall like that being explicitly said necessarily, but,
actually, I don't have any like strong memories of like, oh, the day we talked about it in class or whatnot. I think the overall would probably kind of be similar to what Matt said, like this idea, like, yeah, there is like abstinence is the only way you can ensure you won't, have these things happen to you. But, kind of the wink, wink, I guess, maybe, not like it's okay to do it, but we know kids probably will. And I think that, I don't know, I just feel like the scare thing, I think might be sort of just an indicator that, I don't know if I would say the kids aren't ready to start talking about it, but at least maybe not in that setting, if that makes sense. Like, it's hard, like, it's hard to take a group of 25, 16-year-olds and have someone they don't know maybe incredibly well talk about this type of topic in a super mature way. So I don't know if I don't know. I'm trying to think in my head. I'd have to think about it more. But if that's more of saying these kids just aren't ready to talk about this, or we just kind of recognize it won't be a great conversation, so we're just going to try to scare them out of it. I don't know. I'd have to think about that a little bit more.
So Abby kind of talks about, so like education, and like we kind of shared our experience. But she makes I think, a fairly bold claim that like this is that Planned Parenthood's educational efforts are not like purely altruistic, right? In terms of like trying to save the world, perhaps I would say there's a way you can think of it that way, or they certainly might think of it that way and communicate it that way. But at the same time, like there seems to be this like, okay, like, so yeah, you're giving people contraceptives, which we know aren't going to be terribly effective in this population, just because we know that they're going to struggle with being consistent enough with it. Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty bold claim. Like, had you guys thought about that before? Yeah, had you guys thought about that before encountering the speech? Because I mean, I know Anne-Marie and Claire probably have, just because, yeah, I mean, Anne-Marie's a prolific writer, dare I say. And I know Claire and Anne-Marie have had conversations that I've been privy to, but yeah, I guess what were you guys? Had you guys thought about that dynamic of Planned Parenthood and how they roll?
So I want to take a step back because I feel like it needs to be talked about, addressed a little bit. Obviously, it is bona fide fact. Abby Johnson worked for Planned Parenthood for 9 years or 7 years or whatever it was. Certainly a substantial period of time. But segueing into and then she left Planned Parenthood, obviously, certainly the case. But segueing into the speech, she's making some claims of Planned Parenthood as the boogeyman. Whether or not you agree they're the boogeyman or not is, separate sort of discussion in a sense. So why should we listen to Abby Johnson's in fairness, Abby Johnson does recognize in the speech this conspiratorial sounding like claims of the nature of Planned Parenthood's quote unquote educational model, business model regarding grade school education. So yeah, why should we believe Abby Johnson? How do we know that she's not just an aggrieved departed employee, which is what Planned Parenthood claims that she is?
I think the most basic defense of what she says probably is that she's not the only one. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with Monica Klein. I think it's Cline. Anyhow, I've written a couple articles about her on Live Action, but she's also a former educator for Planned Parenthood previously. And now she has an organization, a nonprofit that she started teaching parents that they need to be the first and primary educators of their children on sexual education matters. So because Planned Parenthood's whole model is to groom your children, to break down their natural inhibitions so that they get to a point where anything goes. Disregarding literature that says that, especially for teenage girls, early onset of sexual activity correlates with all sorts of negative outcomes, academically, psychologically, and down the road in life. So yeah, I mean, you can like Abby Johnson not as a person, but she's not the only person who is saying these things.
Maybe piggybacking off of that, even just like with a slightly different thought from that, I was just gonna like take the thought of, okay, how are they surviving as like a business? Where are they making the most money? And we do know it is through abortions. And so if you're going to make sure you have abortions to keep your doors open, you can't undermine your own business. You know what I mean? Like, why would they do that? So yeah, maybe like contraception, specifically like the birth control pill, isn't safe for women, or there are better options, or we should be doing more research for other options. But to actively go out of their way to promote that themselves would be undermining their own business. So that's why I'm also a little bit like, to argue those two can't go together seems, what's the word I'm looking for? It just doesn't seem like it's unreasonable to argue that.
What?
There we go. Thank you.
There we go.
One more time.
Yeah, I guess just to put a final fine point on what I'm trying to say, I think whenever the discussion gets into intent of individuals, especially in today's climate, like, I mean, I just like looking at end results, the facts on the ground, essentially, versus saying this is what this person intends or this group intends, right? I mean, because when it becomes intent, right? Like, intent, especially when you apply it to a large group, becomes so muddy, because there is no doubt, and Abby Johnson, I think, speaks to this, like, there's no doubt that there's people who work at Planned Parenthood who are hopefully I'm not going to hell for saying this, who are probably better people than me, right? There has to be more than zero, right?
Certainly people who are trying to help.
I know Mike
Absolutely.
very well, and there's a lot of them.
Yeah, and so I think that, now, I mean, obviously speaking into intent some, certain times is certainly useful, but I think, it can just become more subjective than is constructive. So anyway, I'm not trying to say cut the conversation off because you can't prove. But I think it is something worthwhile to think about, that intent dimension.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with you about intent at all. I think that's exactly right, that we shouldn't be judging what we think other people's intent is. I'm just saying in this case, I think the outcomes speak pretty clearly to what the end result is, and presumably that's on purpose. I guess that's what I would say. I think the outcomes are pretty clear what comes from educating kids starting in kindergarten on sex ed.
Yeah, I think that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. Like, kind of just to jump off it a little bit, just with children and like age appropriate things and that type of thing. So now that I have, so I have 3 kids right now. So I mean, just now that I'm starting to think about, they're going to school and what they're being taught and stuff, hearing some things is like, man, that's just, I struggle to find parents that would think that's appropriate. It's not like I think that's wrong. It's like, I would have a hard time finding parents that I know that would agree with that, which is kind of concerning. But it's something else you kind of mentioned that I thought was interesting, like outcomes. I guess I had never really given she mentioned the outcome, I think, 54% of people that have abortions were taking oral I don't remember what she said. It was the pill or just contraception in general.
Just artificial contraception in general.
Artificial contraception in general. But like, I guess and then we looked at kind of trying to look into researching the episode, like a lot of the data on that. That's just not something like the big picture. I guess I'd always thought about those type of things about, contraception or natural family planning. Like I'd always kind of thought about that more individually and like what am I going to do in my life? Yet seeing some of those numbers and like you kind of said, the outcomes don't lie. It was just kind of surprising to me, or not surprising, but I feel like it would be surprising to a lot of people who accept the general narrative that, if we just continue to push contraception, abortion rates will go down. So, because you kind of hear that a lot, I feel like with politicians, even like,
Oh, absolutely.
Even outside of like not getting into the abortion, is it right or wrong debate, but just you'll hear that from a lot of politicians, like, okay, well, like take that out of the equation. Let's just talk about how can we get them less.
Sure.
And that's usually, I feel like, the number one thing that I've heard, at least. So then when you look at the data, it's like, man, that just doesn't really back that up. And I just found that kind of intriguing. So, I guess I thought that was a very interesting kind of way of thinking about it. Like, does it actually work or not? It just doesn't ever get talked about.
Yeah, and that's something that I just found as a fascinating pattern with all the remarkable volume, not even just like a few studies, but like all of these different studies looking at things from different angles, in terms of like unintended pregnancies and abortions and like their relationship with like contraception use, or coverage in the state and availability and things. And yeah, it did seem to be like, it was very striking that like, contraception really doesn't put a dent in abortion numbers.
So the studies that Matt is referring to there.
So I've got one of them pulled up, Mike. So so let's see. This is from I believe Secular Pro-Life. States with zero contraception coverage requirements had the lowest abortion rates at 9.68 abortions per 1,000 women, age 15 to 44. States with 2, 3, and 4 contraception, so that the higher contraception coverage coverage requirements had rates of 14.58, 15.14, and 14.00, respectively. The results could imply that contraception access has actually increased abortion rates, and many pro-lifers try to make that claim. Let's see. The rest of it's more like analysis, not as much data. But either way, I mean, I think there's validity to the kind of perceived safety net of contraception leading to, more risky behavior. Kind of like, just like if you have a seatbelt, great, now you can drive 100 miles an hour, down the interstate, or, something like that, other kind of phenomena that have been observed, that things that would appear to make you safe didn't actually, or maybe only due to a minor degree. And just because of, the perceived risk is less, so, I mean, I think it is a very plausible thing, and that, like, I've never heard a news outlet cover it.
Just provide another layer of clarity to that point. This study wasn't done by secular pro-life. This was a sort of meta-analysis of data by young Miss Monica Snyder, I think, based upon data from the Guttmacher Institute, which is actually a pro-choice reproductive rights type of research body, and the Pew Research Group, which I think identifies as nonpartisan.
Guttmacher Institute, for those who don't know, used to be Planned Parenthood's formal research arm. So they're now technically on their own, but they were previously underneath Planned Parenthood, named after Alan Guttmacher, who was a Planned Parenthood employee.
So I think, I don't know. Sorry, I don't want to take the control because girls, this is your show tonight, Speech Ladies. But something that I think, and not to, I'm not trying to present this as like a devil's advocate, more so as just like a different way of thinking about it. So I like I said, I was kind of surprised, just to be totally honest, looking at some of the data, like it seems like broad, pushing of contraception doesn't necessarily push towards reduced abortion rates, if that's at least, the mantra that we hear a lot from politicians. But I don't know if that necessarily addresses kind of an individual's personal, like, how someone's individually going to come to a decision about how they're going to, plan a family, if you will. So, like I know we talked about NFP a little bit ago, and I'm sure a lot of people don't really know what NFP is, but just kind of the idea, actually, I think Mike actually brought it up in the outline, kind of the gun analogy. Like, yeah, of course, like if you have increased numbers of firearms, there will be increased accidents with guns. But like me as a personal person, I'm a personal person, me as an individual, I feel like, I have a safe in my basement and everything, it's locked, and the code, like it's the chances, the kids physically wouldn't be strong enough to open the safe, and it's locked and there's no way they could find the code. So like, I feel like it's not necessarily a risk for me individually, if that makes sense. So even though I would accept data that says, yep, on a huge scale, that makes sense to me as an individual, it doesn't necessarily make much sense. So I feel like even though the data seems pretty clear, like if you just push contraception, that's not going to bring abortion rates down, which, in Abby Johnson's talk, like, just so people know, like the audience, you're assuming who she's speaking to is pro-life. So she doesn't address like is abortion right or wrong discussion. That's just not what her talk is about. She's, more linking if you assume that abortion is wrong, this is things you need to consider. But I think that that's something else that has to be at least discussed or talked about is, like the fact that they prescribe the pill, the ones that are most likely to fail because, people aren't going to take them correctly or consistently. That doesn't necessarily stop an individual from saying like, but I will, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I think that those are in a way just like two separate questions.
Sure. So are you asking then like, correct me if I'm wrong, but are you trying to ask the question then of like, so if not the pill, then what the heck are you suggesting? Is that kind of what you're getting at, or?
Sort of. And it's kind of funny. Talk about things we're uncomfortable with. In this topic, I can't really correct. I feel, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't feel comfortable correcting the woman's voice here. But no, that's like, yeah, just so what is the other option or what is the best option? For an individual woman, say, she says, I'm very responsible. I would take it correctly, not convince me that I'm wrong, but what option then would she have that would be better than the
Sure.
or whatever means of artificial birth control we're talking about?
Yeah. I think just considering we don't talk about the side effects of contraception extensively, and just opening up that conversation with whomever, let's say this really responsible gal, and she's like, okay, fine, the side effects. The end result, though, that I'd hope to get this gal to would be that there are ways you can understand your body so that you don't actually have to take oral contraception. You can track your own fertility on your own, and it is possible to understand it. You are capable, and it's empowering, and you don't have side effects from it. it's free, and things like that. So I think just ultimately hoping the end goal, right? If you were to say the crazy, crazy idea of saying like you don't need contraception actually, if you're talking to someone who's like, no, I take it responsibly, would be, there's actually education out there to inform you what your body's doing so you can respect its natural cycles, and not get pregnant if you don't want to. Amory, do you have anything more? I'm sure you have lots to add to that, but that would have just been my gut reaction response.
Well, maybe before we go there, Anne Marie, because I think the second part of the speech you guys wanted to highlight might be a good thing to just throw in there
Sure.
right now, because I think this is a good pivot and we can kind of touch all the topics kind of once we get that second part. So why don't you, Anne Marie, if you don't mind, kind of read like what you find to be the most important parts of that second clip from the speech?
And for so long, women have been told by doctors that the only way to cure their fertility is to break it. When you look at studies and you see that where there are higher rates of contraception, there's higher rates of abortion. Because if a woman if she's so desperate not to have a baby that she's willing to give herself cancer, risk of stroke, risk of DVT, risk of osteoporosis, risk of heart attack, if she's that desperate not to have a baby that she's willing to cause that sort of harm to her body, then if she does get pregnant, I think the next logical step would be abortion.
There's an absolutely beautiful way of looking at women's bodies that is fundamentally different from the whole model of sexual education in our country. And that's why I was trying to draw at that point earlier that I don't like the idea of using scare tactics as if we were equating pregnancy with some other type of STD, right? Because there's a woman named Leah Jacobson. She's a lactation consultant, a mom of 7, and she founded what's called the Guiding Star Project. And it's essentially an alternate model of women's healthcare that views the woman's body as healthy and normal. So it rejects a male normative world, essentially saying that women are only equal to men if their bodies are the same as men, and prizes what she calls the feminine superpowers, which are women's abilities to ovulate, gestate, right, to grow a baby, to be pregnant, and to lactate. And so a world that views women as having superpowers like these, right? The ability to conceive new life, the ability to carry it and then to nurture it. That's a fundamentally different way of looking at women's bodies. And I think that it's one that approaches the woman's body with reverence, awe, and respect. And I think that if we start there from that viewpoint with young girls, then we do a lot to address the major self-esteem issues that we tend to see in girls arising specifically in puberty, and going on to the rest of their lives. But I think that it makes sense that women would not trust their bodies when they are told by our society that they can't trust their bodies. Because to quote Leah again, we have to alter, suppress, or destroy their fertility in order for them to be happy and successful people. Claire and I, as we were talking about what videos we would do, she sent me one. It was a 20-minute testimony, essentially, of this girl who got off the pill after, gosh, what was it, 11 years or 14 years or some crazy amount of years, right? And she was talking about all the problems she'd had, including needing to have her gallbladder removed as a consequence of the birth control that she was on. But something she said was so striking to me. She said she was terrified as a teenager of getting pregnant, which concerns me for multiple reasons. One, she clearly didn't know that a woman can't get pregnant every day of the month. Women's fertility isn't like men's fertility, right? I shouldn't say she clearly didn't know that, but it didn't sound like she knew that. And there was also definitely this sense that like pregnancy was kind of, like I said earlier, like another STD, like something terrible that you would catch as opposed to something beautiful. Now, is it something that makes sense for a teenager? That's not to say that that's something that should be going on for teens, but it's very different for a woman to be able to say, I have these superpowers in my body that are so serious, so profound, and so sacred that I can grow another human life, versus I need to avoid getting sick with this thing that could, infect me forever. So that's I think just looking at like talking to a woman who would say, like, well, why would I get off birth control? Because I'm very responsible and I will take it accurately. Well, I would say our whole approach to fertility, the approach that's the preset of contraception, like the assumed position, is one that I fundamentally disagree with, that I think really is in many ways anti-woman, because it takes women's natural bodies and is that they're not good enough. But then also on the flip side of that, I would say there's so much good that you can learn from your body when you're naturally cycling. I don't think most women know what ovulation does for their bodies. That ovulation is absolutely necessary for your breast health. It's necessary for your brain health, your heart health, your immune system. Ovulation impacts multiple body systems, and the whole point of contraception is to shut ovulation down. So I would say that if you are looking to prevent pregnancy, there are absolutely ways that you can do that. Like Claire said, working with the rhythms of your body that do not deprive you of the benefits, the health benefits in particular of ovulation.
So I've been trying to think of the most succinct way to sort of respond. Well, yeah, respond to that. And, basically how Claire got us rolling in response to Ross's question of, if not the pill, now or then what, right? And it was geared more towards, not so much towards married people, but yeah, those people who young women out in the lost adolescent years, like so many of us. And it's like, Anne-Marie and Claire, you're explaining a theology and vision of the body, the woman's body, which, yeah, it's like really inspiring. If I had a daughter and the Dust Girls were teaching a class at the local community college on this topic, I'd be like, yeah, you go get your hiney down to the Dust Girls class and learn some things. But at the same time, it's like, in order to have a certain amount of like rah to that, not to say like it's propaganda so much, but one has to also have underlying that, and I'm willing to be challenged on this, but a certain like appreciation of, I guess you would say, like, phenomenology or a metaphysical layer of reality, which hold on, which historically was sort of developed and advanced through religion, and just having a certain appreciation that the stories and the things that we perceive and can't necessarily measure, like, have value and have meaning. Like that's sort of like a foundation, a groundwork for being able to say, yeah, being a woman is not something that is reducible. Okay, here's, oh man, there's a metaphor that I came up with while I was talking. Here, okay, I don't know if there's a perfect metaphor, but maybe there's something there. So let's take as a metaphor that rather than your goal in this case being this very complex, healthy, strong woman, the objective is to become a, as things often are in this podcast, a stud runner, right? And what is more inspiring? What's gonna really rile up your athletes if you're a coach? Developing the story like, okay, Iliopolis cross country team, this is our first year having a cross country team. No one thinks that we're gonna make it even to sectionals, let alone state. We've only got 5 guys. One of them has an ingrown toenail. One of them is only 5.5 feet tall. No one believes in us, right? Like that kind of like story. That can be like really powerful, right? Or is the story that's gonna move your athlete something reducible, like, hey, Jimmy with the ingrown toenail, look, let's face it, only 1% of people with ingrown toenails have ever made it to state cross-country meet. So, we want you to hit this mark right here. Not this mark down here, right? So the point I'm trying to make in that metaphor is that you need to be a certain kind of person in order to believe in that first story. I'll stop there. Otherwise, I'm gonna ramble. But you guys sort of
No, I
see
totally,
see what I'm getting
I
at.
see what you're saying
Yeah.
for sure.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds sort of like what you're saying is, well, the average girl or woman's not necessarily going to be able to either maybe connect to that, or maybe it won't somehow be possible for her if she hasn't grown up in a religious background, let's say. Is that kind of what you're driving at?
Use the term religious loosely.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay, she has to be coming from a certain place. Well, I mean, I could see that maybe 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, but I mean, you look at the proliferation of femtech, which is right, technology related to essentially women's health and fertility. I mean, it's exploded. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and its value is only going to grow. Okay, so you've got the Clue app. You've got Clue Birth Control, which is now an FDA-approved contraception or contraceptive. So is Natural Cycles app. I mean, these things are gaining significant popularity, and they have no connection to religion whatsoever, even in the loosest terms, right? This is purely secular business. But then let's also talk about okay, well, maybe that's a whole bunch of very educated women using the Natural Cycles app, and maybe those still aren't representative, right? Maybe those still aren't representative of the average woman. So I'm just going to read to you a couple of snippets. I'm not going to quote them, but I'm going to paraphrase them from an article on Natural Womanhood's website from 2020. In the 1980s, Leslie Carroll Botha taught basic fertility awareness training to teen girls, 13 to 17-year-olds, at 8 different restorative care homes for at-risk girls. Typical girl in the program had been a victim of sexual assault, ran away from home, used drugs and alcohol, and ended up in jail. In working with these girls, Mrs. Botha made an amazing discovery. Teens who are taught fertility awareness and how to chart their cycles can regain control of their life. Here's what she found. For 90% of the girls in the program who had ended up in jail, it happened during the premenstrual phase of her cycle. That monthly darkness that Ms. Botha calls falling down the rabbit hole. Symptoms manifested as increased anger, disruptive and self-destructive behavior, suicidal ideation, and drug and alcohol cravings. So after she worked with the girls and taught them to chart their cycles, she found that they were able to purposefully choose different behaviors. They became aware of that monthly rabbit hole, as she called that premenstrual phase, and they were able to choose something different.
No, and I was gonna just add a little something too. I was reading an article about how I think Mother Teresa, so this was what? Mother Teresa hired someone to teach her sisters natural family planning so they could teach their impoverished communities they were serving how to do, I think it was a symptothermal method of charting to figure out how to plan their family. She served 12,000 couples. Their religious community did this. The reason I bring that up is I think because sometimes there's also the argument, and Emery obviously mentioned this by talking about these women ending up in jail, but the idea that your socioeconomic status also means you probably wouldn't be able to figure this out. It's no, they taught impoverished families in India how to do this.
And they still do.
Yeah, and they're still doing it.
Yeah, they still do that. Yeah. Yep. So no, I also think that it's some type of not sexist, classist, whatever it is when you're against people because of their socioeconomic status. I think it's not okay to say that, well, because they're poor, either they don't deserve to have that kind of education or somehow they're not capable. I don't think that people are any less capable one than the other just because they have less money or material resources than other people do. I don't think they're any less deserving of our education and our best efforts to help them, because on the flip side, they're going to have the least money to deal with all the side effects of contraception, especially if they are in a third world country where they're not going to have follow-up care for contraceptives that get placed in them.
Okay, so I mean, yeah, that's obviously compelling on surface level. Mother Teresa, in her group are teaching impoverished young women about NFP, and they're having. Wait, you said eight? Well, you said 12,000 couples too.
It's a lot more than that now.
It's like, okay, if this is actually so successful, I mean, that sounds like a winning model. Then why is it not being implemented? I mean, maybe I'll answer my own question and go back to the. But I'm really incredulous as to it being that simple of, and I mean, yeah, there's certainly like some truth to that, but I'm incredulous as to that being all that answer is, because Planned Parenthood doesn't make money off of it.
I might have an answer to that question, maybe. And like, I guess my question at this point a while ago, kind of like, okay, what else is there? And, we've said NFP quite a few times. So, and Anne-Marie would definitely be better at explaining this than me. But, NFP, natural family planning, it's not some just like random thing that you just guess at. There's a lot of new, like good scientific research to support it, that it is effective. It does work. You can do it. Whether or not that's put out there often or not. But for me, so I'm, married guy, like when we think about what we're going to do to quote unquote plan our family, I remember, so I'll tell a quick story, and I don't remember exactly when I had this thought, but at some point, thinking about marriage, and I don't remember if I was engaged, thinking about it. I don't remember where we were, but it kind of hit me like, yeah, there are side effects to contraception. And yeah, I'm sure a lot of people would say it's very low side effects and all that stuff. But I mean, at the same time, they are there, right? So anytime you have any sort of risk, I feel like you have to weigh the reward and the alternatives. And so for me, it was kind of like, and again, I mean, I'm oversimplifying all of this, but I kind of had a thought of, I could have my wife, I could have, like, I control her, but we could decide as a couple that my wife would take a pill that, even if it's a low chance, like does have possible side effects, I guess, or, abstain from sexual activity for a certain period of time. And I just kind of remember having the thought of like, how would I come to the first response? Like, what would that be, the best part of me or not the best part of me, that came to the conclusion that, I'm willing to risk, even if it's a low chance, I get that, but like, I'm willing to risk a side effect so that I can have sex more. I don't know. And I know that's a super generalized simplification of it, but that really struck.
But it was a real thought that you had.
Yeah, absolutely. Like that wasn't a legitimate thought that I had.
Hypothetically identify with.
Yeah. So I remember thinking like, is I don't know, like, is that the best part of me that's coming to this conclusion? And I'm sure other people would say, yeah, there's other reasons for it. And I'm not trying to say that that's a perfect analogy, but that kind of thought came to my head. It seems like there is a method that works that has zero side effects. So I remember at least thinking about, like, it seems like it should be a relatively simple solution. But to kind of answer Mike's question, and not that I disagree completely with, I think, Claire's response that, there's no money in it, but, I mean, it's hard to do, though, at the same time. So I think that's kind of part of the answer, is it's harder to do that. So I feel like we should at least address that a little bit, as far as to tie all that together. Yes, you can have, a good, a kind of a healthy way to look at women's bodies. Anne-Marie, what she said about, being a superhero, I thought that was actually a pretty cool way to describe how women's bodies naturally work. It's interesting to me that, our sell for women's freedom is we're going to change them. That seems pretty contradictory, but, or dissonant. But I think something to kind of talk about, to Mike's question, is like, why is this not more prevalent if it's a healthy, good alternative that gives you the best version, like that best supports women and puts them up? Is it can be very difficult to do. So in some ways it's not, there's an easy way out, at least is what we're told. So I don't know if that makes sense or ties together well, but I tried to, kind of bring a couple thoughts together there.
I think that makes perfect sense. Yeah, I appreciate that.
And I think even on a larger scale, beyond just like the individual decision making on like, oh, this is easier to do the pill, let's just do that. I think that the fact that both abortion and contraception are closely tied together, which I don't think anyone really deny necessarily. I know Abby Johnson kind of tied them together in a very particular way, but even outside of that, like I think they are very closely tied together, right? They're both an effort to allow for sexual activity with like less long-term repercussions, right? Which I think brings us back to like the sexual revolution, like where kind of both of these issues became more of an issue in the first place, you know? So I think there are just big like cultural movements that have stemmed from the sexual revolution that lead to the use of birth control too, beyond it just being like harder on an individual level. Like it's also just there are big movers and shakers who like, yeah, who don't want to let the sexual revolution go and don't want to let go some of the fruits from that. But at the same time, I think it's like, I don't know, that was like in the 60s, right? It's 50 years ago plus, you know, whatever. All right. Like, I think it's high time, like we just kind of look at the fruits of it, like what has happened after the sexual revolution. And like what has been the repercussions has like, our families healthier now, our relationships better now, are people happier, are women happier, you know, are women being taken better care of health wise.
Are there fewer women living in poverty? Are there fewer children born into out of wedlock homes?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, and I think that there's a lot of those outcome measures that you maybe the people who were on board with the sexual revolution in the first place were hoping would pan out. Or maybe there was other stuff behind it, like who knows, whatever the case may be, like, yeah, I think it is high time we kind of look at that. And I think this kind of cuts into the intent piece too, because like, I would imagine most people in Planned Parenthood aren't nefariously like, you know, laughing and celebrating the number of abortions they have. So they certainly may not intend that link by that, but they're certainly intending it insofar as like, yeah, just by the nature of the world and how it works in terms of sex, babies, men, women, relationships, how all of those things are connected. Like when you break those connections, like it just doesn't work the same way, you know, and it's not going to work well. And yeah, like a contraception will lead to more abortion, you know, or at least continued abortion. Yeah, just because like you're messing with things in a way that they're never intended to be messed with. In the words of Malcolm from Jurassic Park, life finds a way. You know, but yeah, no, I think there's a lot like absolutely. And like, I really like that analogy you used, Ross, about like your decision making. And that plays itself out on the individual level, but there's also, I think, bigger picture things that, yeah, it's like, why isn't it talked about much? It's like, well, yeah, there's a lot of, if you talk about contraception, you have to talk about abortion. If you talk about abortion, you have to talk about marriage. If you talk about marriage, you have to talk about men and women and how they relate to one another and like, what is humanity? And, you know, yeah, those are a lot of big questions that like people that aren't expediently to answer politically, you know? So it gets hairy pretty quick.
Matt, can you share with us the quote that you had from the outline that Mike really pointed out? Like, yeah, let's make sure that we throw this out there.
Well, yeah, and I guess, yeah, maybe a shorter version of all that mumbo jumbo I just said would be like, so what our modern culture has rejected is the idea that there is a coherent description of men and women. Like that's a possible thing. In the wake of that rejection, there's this new kind of capitalist, materialist anthropology that's emerging, where men and women are now seen as genderless widgets that exist to generate enough wealth to live as pleasantly as they can until they die. I guess any sort of like gendered view of humanity, like a gendered ideology, or not ideology, a gendered anthropology, yeah, like at least in America, like we're capitalists and we're materialists. So like what's going to happen? Like, well, we're going to want to make money. We're going to want to have sex and enjoy carnal pleasures, and free love, man. And like, yeah, it's going to, that's kind of what's happened. And yeah, I don't know if there's been a lot of great fruit from that. And maybe on the other side of things, beyond just like arguing against some of the fruit from the sexual revolution, just kind of like arguing for something in its place. Give me a second here. Where
It's
did
right
it go?
up here.
Oh, sorry. Claire pointed this out, and I was like, oh.
Why did you whisper it?
What?
Why did you whisper
Well,
it?
Oh, he was mid-sentence.
Oh, yeah. Good idea, Claire.
Oh, that.
Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, I don't have an answer to that question, but so one of the articles, the live action articles that were posted, had a note that while 40 to 50% of couples who contracept reportedly divorce, the divorce rate among couples who use fertility awareness methods is only 3 to 5%. Carney believes this is due, this was from the article. Carney believes this is due to a fundamental difference in mindset among those using NFP, one that values the woman as a whole person and doesn't pathologize her fertility, and which views children as a blessing and a joy rather than a burden.
Yeah, I've heard that statistic before. I mean, I remember hearing it in college. But there's 1,050 other things that someone who's practicing NFP are doing that are good for their marriage. I mean, I don't think it's difficult to attribute such massive weight that using NFP is going to bind your marriage together. I'm not saying it doesn't, but I mean, I just feel like that's applying more weight than one can through that one particular statistic. But
I think to be fair, though, I mean, you can say that, but you can also say that using contraception goes along with lots of other attitudes and behaviors and practices as well, right? Like, what do we ever do that's completely in isolation, one thing from everything else?
yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, on a hypothetical, my first thought was, yeah, but like most people that use NFP are probably Catholic, and the Catholic Church doesn't approve of divorce. So like I could see someone making the claim that there's like other reasons they are choosing not to, whether or not they're in a happy marriage or not. But on a more like personal level, I think that, again, just to kind of think about my own life a little bit, something I don't think I would have known going into marriage, maybe not, I would have said I known, but I would have said that I knew this, but I did not, was just like, it does have other positive effects that I wouldn't have foreseen. So like example, but like, I actually I feel like it helps our marriage that I understand a little bit more about just my wife's body, what she's going through, how it's supposed to work, how it works naturally, and how we can, just cooperate with that, in a sense. And I actually feel like that does help me to know her better as a person, which I do feel like draws us closer together. So, I would believe that people who it's like, yeah, it's hard sometimes and it's a sacrifice, but it does seem like there are parts of it that actually draw us closer together, where if we weren't forced to do that, they just wouldn't exist.
Something else I really like about natural family planning, and I do want to make one clarification. In religious circles, it's more well known as natural family planning. In the secular sphere, it's a lot more common to describe fertility awareness methods, but that's actually not one method. It is an umbrella term. So that refers to multiple different ways of using different biomarkers in the woman's cyclical patterns of fertility and infertility to determine whether she's fertile or infertile at any given time. And the effectiveness does vary depending on the method, right? There are evidence-based methods that with perfect use have equivalent pregnancy prevention effectiveness to, any form of birth control on the market, really, especially the pill. And even with typical use, are still pretty consistent with the pill, for instance. But so just want to put that out there, that we're not just referring to like one thing, we're referring to a whole umbrella term of methods. But One thing I think is really beautiful that comes from using fertility awareness is this sense of shared responsibility between the man and the woman for their fertility as a couple. And we talked about that in the outline. We kind of got into that whole conversation of like, well, how come men don't have to take birth control? Like, why aren't male contraceptives a thing? And I wrote an article about this a couple months ago that I linked to. And there are many reasons. Biology, the male biology versus the woman's biology is one of them. And the woman, you're shutting down once a cycle event, and men, you have to shut down an event that happens every single day, which is the production of millions more sperm. But also there is a double standard between what side effects are considered acceptable in men versus in women. And the beauty of fertility awareness is that you sidestep that whole conversation of like, okay, the woman has to be on the pill, or the woman has to have an IUD in, or she has to have Depo-Provera, or fill in the blank. Fertility awareness says this is our fertility and we take responsibility for it. And so, no, it's not, my husband pressuring me about anything, because he understands that this is our responsibility. And we together as a team take into account what our pregnancy intentions are or not.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I think there is a lot of truth there. I think to riff on, I guess, the other side of the coin to that, something I was thinking about, it's like, man, how has someone not said out loud, especially given our climate, that artificial birth control is the most overlooked blight of sexism in the past 60 years.
Some people are saying
Yeah,
that.
oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, that's just wild. Yeah, I mean, I think along the same note, sort of like a little bit of a thought experiment, and the riff on something that Matt had said in another episode. Okay, so let's just say for hypotheticals, that the most real way to sleep with your spouse is to practice NFP, because it requires being conscientious of their fertility, and it requires discipline and simply restraint on the male's part. I mean, the woman's part too, but yeah. Okay, so right, and so for that reason, because you're involving a greater volume of the other person, right? Their mental, their physical, their spiritual, right? All these different things going on, that it makes it a more real and meaningful experience, right? So on the other end of that, where let's say that both people are just imagining someone else when they're sleeping with this other person, right? Like that, I think is easier for people to see as like, oh yeah, that's terrible. Now, obviously, I'm sure a lot of people do that, but I think you'd have a lot more people saying, a lot more just average, everyday Joes, or Janes, saying something like, oh yeah, no, that's terrible. That's way too transactional, or that is transactional, right? And I think, it's not to simply say, oh, well, obviously then whatever method of NFP you're using, like that's the right way. But I think it's that sort of thought experiment should at least open the door to recognizing that there are ways of engaging in sex that open you up more profoundly, more deeply to the entire person, rather than just one tiny part of them, right? And okay, to just keep running with that metaphor too, is like other like transactional affairs of society, no pun intended, but like ordering food at a restaurant, right? There's something that we generally consider like off or wrong if you treat your waiter or waitress like a piece of garbage, like no please, no thank you, no eye contact, right? To recognize that both of you are in the midst of this very complex and elegant and confusing and inspiring journey that one calls life, versus just, hey, give me the burger with no onions, right? We recognize that dichotomy in that. And as G.K. Chesterton says, there's a Catholic way to climb a tree, so it's, yeah. So what is the Catholic way to climb a tree, Ross?
Up.
I believe you go up the tree.
Don't scrape too much bark off it, or else you reduce its carbon sequestration.
Exactly.
So maybe I don't know if this will be a final question. Maybe this is a little too broad for a final question, but I guess what does Abby Johnson's speech say about motherhood in general? Like what should we learn about motherhood? This is the Speeches about Speeches by Moms series. Yeah, like what should we call to mind about our mothers? How should we treat motherhood as we encounter it, in day-to-day life, either, our wives or our moms or neighbors who are moms.
There's no easy way out, and that's in a good way. So like we talked about in our last episode, like motherhood is supposed to be hard. Motherhood is hard. That was, I believe, the title of the episode or the quote in it. But like that's not in a negative way. It's in like a life-changing way. And then I think that's what we talked about last episode a lot. And I think it's kind of the same thing in this episode, but more of as opposed to motherhood, it's the fertility and reproduction side of it, right? Like there isn't just an easy way out of it, but that's not bad. It's a very, like Anne Marie has said multiple times, like it's a very good thing. It's a very beautiful thing. And you shouldn't just, and you can't just find an easy way out of it. It just doesn't exist. So I feel like that's kind of what I took. My biggest thought was from this is that there isn't some magic way to just make it disappear, but that's okay. Like there shouldn't be, because it's not a bad thing in the first place.
Right.
And maybe, I guess on the man side of things, in terms of how a man should treat and revere motherhood, like obviously we should do that, but like Ross said, like, yeah, that isn't easy either. Like there are sacrifices you have to make to do that, right? Like you have to respect your mother when she tells you to do things you don't want to do, as you're growing up. You should respect your mother when she like gives you advice as an adult, right? Like you need to respect that. That's not always easy. You need to step up and like take care of your wife, like when she needs you, as she's certainly around like very motherly things like giving birth and feeding, taking care of kids. Like, yeah, like that's not easy either. And like you need to, I think we use the term buck up, guys, in terms of, I would say, I don't know if there's data necessarily on this, but yeah, if men are more supportive and if men valued motherhood and if men were more dutiful in like their half of the bargain in relation to like children, like, yeah, there would be a lot less abortions. And yeah, there would be a lot more honorable relationships and like sound families for children to grow up in. So yeah, as much as we kind of like talk about women on this episode, and like rightfully so, I think it more directly affects them. But yeah, like men, like, yeah, it's not easy for women. So like, don't be a turd and just make it even harder on them, So
I think I'll just add briefly, living fertility awareness in my marriage. One of the goods that I see from that is that my husband knows where I am in my cycle and respects that. And he knows that the possibility, like, he knows what can come from sex. Like, we both understand that. There are no surprises for us. And he also sees the sacrifices that I'm putting in every day as a mother, but he also sees what it's like to be pregnant. He knows, he's seen me postpartum multiple times now. And he seeks to make himself available and to sacrifice for me. So like, just as a very practical instance, this week I've been schlepping our oldest to Totus Tuus, which is a Catholic summer camp that's half an hour away. I've been driving 2 hours every day in the car to get him there and back. And it's been exhausting, especially with my youngest, who's 7 months old. He's still mostly breastfed and he's been super cranky, and it's just been like very draining. So James just told me this afternoon, like, you know what? I'm just going to take like an hour of PTO tomorrow and I'll take him in and you can just pick him up. Like, that's so helpful to me. That's so helpful to me. But he's doing something that's inconvenient for him as a gift to me because he realizes that I'm busting my ass every day to be the best mom I can be for these kids, the best mom to his children. And as part of that, the best wife to him. So it's like a way drilled down micro level of what comes when you respect fertility and motherhood. But that's what it looks like in my life, and I'm grateful for it.
Yeah, that's cool. That's interesting.
Claire, do you have any stories about how great I am?
Yeah, Claire said nothing. Anne Marie just had like a long spiel about how awesome James is, and I was kind of, I kind of feel bad now. But the fact that Claire said nothing about Matt makes me feel pretty good.
No, I feel like you guys all said some pretty good.
I can always cut this out if I get too scared, but I'm just gonna go with it. So
Don't podcast scared.
So recently we had a friend's bachelor party and everyone went around giving marriage advice, and one of our friends, more of an acquaintance for me, he's a counselor, and the advice that he gave was don't be afraid to say the word penis and vagina, right, between the married couple, right? And I think in that audience we figured out relatively quickly what he was getting at, right? But he followed up with something like, yeah, most couples wait 6 to 7 years before they start having those conversations, then it's too late. And to put a fine point, in the cases where it's not obvious to hear that, but I think the point, it connects to this fertility discussion because expressing what one is, I can only speculate, what one is looking for and needing and wanting in sex between a couple, like that is like sort of awkward and vulnerable. Like even though you do it all of the time, right? It's still this profoundly like real and speculating overwhelming thing. But it is like very real. But when one is afraid to talk about it in the way that our friend was encouraging our other friend to not be afraid of, it's like it's just immersing yourself even more into the depths of life that we always experience but are so afraid to like really step into for 1,000 different reasons, which are like understandable, right? That we can all identify with. Man, here's just like another, it's much lighter and much more benign, but it is another example of just real life exposure. That's a good metaphor for it. But at wakes or visitations, and I've mentioned this before, I think in a different podcast episodes with David Foster Wallace, I think, but when you had, and I think this is unfortunately only with Catholic wakes or visitations, when you have the genuflector there, and I wouldn't say no one ever prays there, but it certainly doesn't feel often. But I'm always intentional about saying a prayer to like right there, kneeling down inches away where you can reach out and touch the body, because that's why you're there, right? You're not there to spend 30 feet away from the dead body having conversation. I mean, you have some conversations about nothing, but not like using them as this crutch to try to distract yourself. No, it's at least for a few moments, fully expose yourself to the full weight of life, right? The metaphor is that, yes, it's really honestly not that hard to talk about a funeral. They happen, right? But to really expose yourself to that body in the same way with like sex is like, yeah, clearly it does not require that much maturity to have sex based upon what we observe in the world. But to actually talk about it in the very real and meaningful ways that can affect your soul and change the course of your life and the course of communities, like that's what takes maturity and responsibility and is inspiring and moving to people. That's what Abby Johnson means to stay on point.
Claire just told me 5 really amazing stories about me. So,
Oh my gosh. Okay.
so just so you know, they're out there.
Matt.
What do we have going on next episode?
I believe Mike would be the person. Mike, what do we got?
We got, and that's where I insert it.
I feel like being on our podcast is kind of seeing how the podcast sausage is made. You know, it's like all the random crap that doesn't make it in, and you know, gives me hope that we can someday be a reasonable podcast.
I think we're
think so,
getting
too.
there.
We'll see.
Rachel Bauer texted me and she said she loved last episode.
I liked last episode.
Yeah, I liked it a lot too.
Anne Marie and Claire, do you guys know who Carrie Gress is?
Oh, yeah.
Do they know who Carrie Gress is?
I was going to say.
I'm just asking.
They are.
She's awesome.
Mansplainer.
Have you read any of her books?
Can I explain to you what a theology of home should look like?
Her book, The Anti-Mary Exposed, is the single best book that I read in 2020. And I read 18 books that year. So that was number 1.
Okay, Anne-Marie and Claire, I'm going to let you guys sign us off for the night. Make sure you get it right or else you're not coming back.
Thanks for drinking
And thinking
with us.
It's a soft G, though. Love it. Cue the music one more time.
Road will lead us to a better place.